He said it loud enough for the whole table to hear. That's just the gardener. Not a whisper. Not an aside. A declaration. Like he wanted everyone at that table, the city councilman, the two developers in Italian suits, the woman from the governor's office, to understand exactly where I ranked in the social order of that evening. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He was already turning back to his wine glass, already moving on, already certain that a man like me didn't require a full sentence. I was still standing, still holding the back of the chair I'd pulled out to sit down. My daughter, Elena, stared at her plate. And I thought, not for the first time, but more clearly than ever before, that Marcus had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. He just didn't know it yet. And I was in absolutely no rush to tell him. Let me take you back to how we got to that table. Because this story doesn't start with one insult. It never does. It starts years earlier, with a man who decided that the quiet ones don't count. That the ones with dirt under their fingernails have nothing worth hearing. That a life built slowly, without noise, without performance, is not really a life at all. Marcus Hale married my daughter 6 years ago in a ceremony I paid for, at a venue I had chosen, with flowers arranged by a man I had known for 30 years. He stood at that altar in a suit I'm fairly certain he had financed, smiled at me with his full set of teeth, and shook my hand like we were partners. Like we understood each other. We didn't. Within the first year, I understood exactly who Marcus was. Not a bad man in the cinematic sense. No dramatic cruelty. No raised voice. Something quieter and, in many ways, worse. Marcus was the kind of man who sorted people by usefulness, and then discarded the ones he'd already extracted value from. He'd done it to 2 business partners before me, according to Elena, who mentioned it once and then never mentioned it again. He did it to friends when they stopped being impressive. And slowly, methodically, without ever announcing it, he did it to me. The first sign was small. A dinner at their house, 18 months after the wedding. I arrived to find that my chair, the one I always sat in at their table, near the window, where Elena had placed me every single time we'd eaten together in that house, had been moved. In its place was a folding chair. The kind you use for overflow guests at a party. I said nothing. I sat in it. I ate the meal. I drove home 40 minutes through night traffic and I sat in my own kitchen in the dark for a while, thinking. The second sign came at Marcus's company launch party. He'd started a real estate development consultancy, which was a very impressive sounding name for what was essentially Marcus helping wealthy people buy property and calling it strategy. He invited 60 people. Elena introduced me to 3 of them. Marcus introduced me to none. When I ended up near a conversation he was having with a potential investor, he steered the man away with a hand on his shoulder, like I was a draft of cold air he didn't want getting into the room. By year 2, I had become invisible at family events. By year 3, I had become a punchline. Not publicly, not yet. But I could feel it in the architecture of the room. The way Marcus's friends looked at me, if they looked at me at all. The way he'd tell a story about Elena's family that always seemed to contain, somewhere in the middle, a gentle joke about the simplicity of where she came from. Of who her father was. What her father did. What did her father do? He grew things. That was how Marcus told it. That was the story he built. Elena's father grows things for other people. Has his hands in the dirt. Drives a truck that's seen better days. Lives in a house with a garden that takes up more square footage than the house itself. Showed up to the rehearsal dinner in a jacket that was 3 years out of fashion. Doesn't really understand business or finance or the kind of rooms Marcus had worked so hard to get into. What Marcus told people, in so many words and in the exact language of a man who considers himself too sophisticated for outright cruelty, was that I was a gardener. And gardeners didn't really belong at the table. They maintained the grounds. They waited outside. Here's what Marcus did not know. Here's what, in 6 years of carefully managing my image as the quiet, grateful, slightly simple father-in-law, I had never once corrected him about. I had not been a gardener for a very long time. I need to tell you something about what I actually built. Not to impress you, but because what happens next requires you to understand the weight of what Marcus was dismissing every single time he told that story at a dinner party. I started with a single landscaping contract in 1987. I was 24 years old. The contract was for a municipal park, 8 acres, 3-year deal, worth just over $40,000 total. I drove to that meeting in a truck with a cracked windshield, and I parked 2 blocks away because I didn't want them to see the truck before they shook my hand. I got the contract. I delivered the work. And then I got another one. Over the next 37 years, I built what eventually became Aldrin Grounds and Land Development, a company that moved from residential landscaping into commercial land management, then into municipal infrastructure contracts, then into a specialization that nobody talks about at dinner parties but that every major city needs desperately: ecological restoration. The reclamation of degraded land. The conversion of brownfields and industrial sites into usable green space. The kind of work that sounds quiet and earthy but that carries contracts worth millions. The kind of work that, when done correctly, puts your name in civic planning documents and city budgets and mayoral speeches. I had 17 full-time employees. I had contracts in 4 counties. I had relationships with city offices that I had cultivated, quietly and patiently, the same way I cultivated everything, over years, with consistency, without drama. And I had, in the 12 months before that dinner, been awarded a land restoration contract by the city that was the largest of its kind in the region's history. A $41 million project to restore 1,800 acres of post-industrial land along the river corridor. A project that had taken 3 years of proposal work, 2 rounds of competitive bidding, and a final presentation to the mayor's office that I had given myself, in a room with 9 city officials, in a suit that was absolutely not 3 years out of fashion. The mayor knew my name. He had known my name for years. Marcus had no idea. And here's the thing about that. I want you to sit with this for a moment, because it's the part that matters most. I didn't hide this from Marcus out of strategy, not initially. I hid it, or more accurately, I simply never corrected the narrative, because I had spent my entire life not needing people to know. My clients knew. My employees knew. The city planning department knew. The people who mattered to the work knew. I had never needed a son-in-law's approval to feel real. I didn't perform my life for audiences. I just lived it. But I had watched Marcus perform his for 6 years. And I had watched what happened when he thought nobody important was watching. So I stayed quiet. And I watched. And I waited for the moment when the world would do the correcting for me. That moment arrived on a Thursday evening in October. Marcus had been invited to a gala. The City Planning and Development Awards, an annual event that the mayor's office co-hosted with the Regional Chamber of Commerce. It was, in Marcus's world, a significant evening. The kind of room where deals happened over appetizers, where a handshake could turn into a contract, where being seen by the right people mattered enormously. He had secured a table, a corporate table, 8 seats, $4,000, for his consultancy and a handful of clients he was trying to impress. He invited Elena. He did not invite me. I found out about the evening through Elena, who mentioned it in passing when she called me about something else. She sounded careful when she brought it up. She'd learned to be careful about Marcus-related information around me, in the same way you learn to be careful when you know a floor has a weak board somewhere, and you haven't yet located it. She said it quietly, the gala, Thursday, downtown, and then moved on quickly. I didn't press her. I was already going to be there. My name was on the program. Had been for 3 weeks. The city had asked me to be present as the awarded contractor for the River Corridor Restoration Project, which was being formally recognized at the gala as the Regional Project of the Year. The mayor was going to speak about it. I had been told, by the event coordinator, that I should expect to be called up. I want to tell you that I engineered what happened next. That I planned it precisely, that I knew exactly where Marcus would be sitting, that I arranged the evening like a chess player finishing a game. The truth is simpler and somehow better. I simply showed up. I wore the dark suit. I sat at the table the city had assigned me, which was, I later realized, 2 tables away from Marcus's. I accepted a glass of water. I said hello to the councilman on my left, who'd been a contact of mine for 11 years. I talked with the woman from the State Environmental Office about the river project timeline. I was completely calm. Marcus arrived at 7:15 with Elena and 4 clients in tow. I saw him before he saw me. He was in his element, back straight, handshakes confident, voice carrying just enough across the room to signal that he belonged here. He seated his group, gestured to the waitstaff, ordered wine with the quiet authority of someone who had rehearsed quiet authority. Elena sat beside him. I watched her scan the room. She found me. Her expression did something complicated. She gave a small wave. I nodded. Marcus was talking to the man on his right, one of the developers I recognized from various city meetings, when he turned and saw me. The shift in his face was small. A flicker. Something recalibrating. I was, in his mental map of the world, not supposed to be here. Not at this table. Not in this room. Not wearing this suit. He recovered quickly. Marcus always recovered quickly, it was one of his genuine talents, and turned back to his conversation. 20 minutes later, the councilman beside me left to greet someone across the room, and for a moment the chair was empty. Marcus was passing behind our table with one of his clients, gesturing around the room in the way of a man giving a private tour of his own territory, when he noticed the empty chair. He stopped. He looked at me. Sitting there. And then he said it? Not cruelly. Casually. Which was worse? That's just the gardener. His client, a heavy man in a blue suit, nodded slightly, losing interest immediately. They moved on. Marcus didn't look back. I picked up my water glass. The councilman returned to his seat. I said nothing. At 8:45, the mayor took the podium. I want to describe this room to you because the room matters. 312 people. Round tables draped in white linen. A raised stage at the front with city seals and sponsor banners flanking a single podium. The kind of room where silence, when it comes completely. Where if someone calls your name, every person at every table hears it. Mayor Dennis Caro had been mayor for 9 years. He was not a man who wasted words. He was the kind of public official who had the rare gift of making a room feel like he was speaking directly to each person in it. He began with the standard acknowledgments, the sponsors, the chamber leadership, the city council members present. He spoke briefly about the year. He talked about the city's development priorities. And then he shifted. But what I want to spend real time on tonight, he said, is a project that, frankly, changed how I think about what this city can do. He talked about the river corridor. He talked about 1,800 acres. He talked about the 3-year timeline, the competitive process, the vision required to see what that land could become. He talked about economic impact. The studies projected a $400 million increase in surrounding property values over 20 years. He talked about what it meant for the city's environmental commitments. He talked about the families who would walk those paths, the schools that would use those acres, the wildlife that was already returning to land that had been dead for 40 years. And then he said a name. None of this exists without one person. A man I've had the privilege of working with for nearly a decade. A man who, in my experience, doesn't talk about what he's done, he just does it, and then he shows you the results. Would you please join me in recognizing the founder and director of Aldrin Grounds and Land Development, the man this city owes a great debt to, Mr. Raymond Aldrin? I stood up. I want to tell you about the moment I stood up because it lasted longer than it should have, in the best possible way. There is a particular quality to the silence in a room of 300 people when something shifts and nobody has yet processed what shifted. It was in that silence that I pushed my chair back. That I straightened my jacket. That I walked toward the stage with the particular calm of a man who has been walking toward things his whole life without announcing it first. I passed 2 tables away from Marcus Hale. I did not look at him. But I know what he saw. He saw the mayor step away from the podium and extend his hand. He saw the room stand, not all at once, but in the rolling wave of a standing ovation that begins when enough people decide something deserves it. He saw the city seal behind my head as I shook the mayor's hand. He saw 300 people, including the councilman who had been sitting beside me all evening, including the developers at his own table, including the woman from the governor's office who had been 3 chairs away from me when Marcus made his comment about the gardener. He saw all of them looking at me. He heard the mayor say into the microphone, with the easy familiarity of genuine relationship, "Ray, we couldn't have done this without you. This city is better because of you." I said a few words. I thanked my team. I thanked the city. I kept it short because I have always believed that the people who most deserve the room talk the least when they have it. I walked back to my table. The applause followed me the whole way. I sat down. I picked up my water glass. I did not look at Marcus's table for the rest of the evening. I didn't need to. Elena called me the next morning at 7:48. She was crying before I even said hello, not the crying of grief, but the complicated kind, the kind that happens when something that has been held in place for a very long time finally releases. She said she'd had no idea. She said she thought she'd known, somewhat, that I was successful, but she hadn't understood the scale. She said she was sorry. She said it 3 times. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I told her I loved her. I told her none of what I'd built was about proving something to anyone. That was true. It was also true that I'd let this particular story stay uncorrected for 6 years, and that somewhere in that decision was a patience I don't fully know how to explain, only that it felt right. That some things clarify themselves if you give them enough time and enough rope. She asked me what happened after I went back to my seat. I told her that about 11 minutes after I sat down, one of Marcus's clients, the developer in the blue suit, the one Marcus had been speaking to when he made his comment, had stood up from Marcus's table, crossed the room, and introduced himself to me. That he'd handed me a card and said he'd been following the River Corridor project, and would like to discuss a potential collaboration. That he'd stayed for 15 minutes. That when he walked back to Marcus's table, he did not resume his previous conversation with Marcus. That Marcus spent the last 40 minutes of the gala essentially alone at a table of people who had all, by that point, independently recalibrated who in that room was worth talking to. Elena was quiet for a moment. "Did he say anything to you?" she asked. "At the end. When you were leaving?" "He had. I was putting on my coat near the exit when I heard his voice behind me. Raymond. Not Ray. Not the gardener. Raymond." I turned around. Marcus was standing there with the specific expression of a man who has just discovered that the floor he's been standing on is not the floor he thought it was. A kind of hollow recalibration. He opened his mouth and then closed it. He tried again. "I didn't know," he said. "About the project. About all of it. I didn't know." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the folding chair. The launch party. 6 years of dinner conversations where I was the quiet background detail in someone else's story about themselves. I thought about Elena staring at her plate. "I know you didn't," I said. And I put on my coat and I walked out. That was 4 months ago. In those 4 months, several things have happened that I think are worth knowing about, not because I take pleasure in the accounting. I genuinely don't. But because the accounting is how you understand what that one evening actually cost Marcus Hale, measured in real and concrete terms, not in sentiment. The developer in the blue suit, his name is Gerald Foss, and he runs a land acquisition group with projects in 3 states, signed a consulting agreement with Aldrin Grounds 2 months after the gala. The initial scope is $1.2 million for site assessment and restoration planning on a former manufacturing campus outside the city. Gerald told me, at our first formal meeting, that he'd been looking for a firm with our specific expertise for over a year. He'd been referred, vaguely, by the councilman. He'd been at the gala because a client of his had invited him. He'd been at Marcus's table because Marcus had been that client's consultant on an unrelated deal. He has not, to my knowledge, engaged Marcus on anything since the gala. The woman from the governor's office, Her name is Sandra Veth, she runs the state's land remediation grant program. Sent my company a letter of interest regarding 3 state-level restoration projects currently in the early planning phase. Combined projected value, somewhere between $8 and $14 million, depending on scope. We are in the early stages of discussions. Sandra was seated 3 chairs from Marcus when he made his comment about the gardener. I know this because she mentioned it, unprompted, at our first meeting. She said it with a kind of calm precision that told me she had filed it away carefully. That kind of thing tells you a lot about a person, she said. I always pay attention to how people treat whoever they think doesn't matter. Marcus's consultancy, as of last month, lost its largest active client, a property developer who had been generating approximately 60% of Marcus's annual revenue. I know this because Elena told me. And Elena told me because she is my daughter, and she was worried, and she is caught in the middle of something she didn't choose. The client didn't give a specific reason for ending the relationship. Sometimes they don't need to. Sometimes a room of 300 people is reason enough. Marcus called me twice in the weeks after the gala. I let both calls go to voicemail. His messages were careful, friendly even. He mentioned getting together for lunch. He mentioned a project he thought might be interesting for me to hear about. He mentioned Elena. The 3rd time he called, I answered. He suggested lunch. I suggested he focus on his business. I said it without any particular edge. Just as information. He hasn't called since. Elena and I have dinner every Sunday now, which is new. Not because something dramatic shifted between us, she was never the problem. But because I think she needed permission to have a relationship with me that existed outside of the shape Marcus had constructed for it. She comes alone sometimes. We eat in the garden. She asks me questions about the work I've done over the years, the projects, the history of all of it, and I answer them. She listens like someone catching up on a story they'd been told the wrong version of for years. Last Sunday she told me that Marcus had asked her, recently, whether I might be open to meeting with him professionally. Whether I might be able to connect him with anyone from the city planning office. Whether there was a possibility, now that the nature of my work was understood, that there might be opportunities in that world that Marcus could be part of. She told me she'd told him she'd ask. I heard that. I nodded. I finished what was on my plate. Tell him I'll think about it, I said. She knew what that meant. She nodded too. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine for a moment. Outside, the garden was doing what gardens always do, growing quietly, without permission, without announcement, without waiting for anyone to decide it was allowed. I built something over 37 years that one man spent 6 years pretending wasn't there. He introduced me to a room as the gardener. The mayor introduced me to that same room by my name. And the room had 300 witnesses to the difference. Some corrections don't need your help. They just need time and an honest audience. And sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to a man who has spent years making you small is to simply let the world show him how wrong he was, at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right room, with exactly the right people watching. I drove home that night in the same truck I've always driven. Parked it in front of the same house. Walked through the same garden. Some things don't need to change just because everything else did.